On a rainy night, Grace hurried out of the supermarket, pushing a cart loaded with groceries for the kids at her orphanage. But just as she checked her list, she spotted an old woman sitting barefoot by the road, trembling, her eyes vacant and lost. Grace hesitated. She had nothing left to give, but the haunting image of her own mother dying in her arms years ago stopped her. She turned back to help, unaware that in the shadows a man was watching. When their paths cross again, a long-buried truth will change all their lives forever. Before we continue, tell us what time it is and where you're watching from. And subscribe, because tomorrow I've got something extra special for you. The evening air bit sharp against Grace's cheeks as she stepped out of the grocery store, her arms wrapped around 2 paper bags filled with snacks and small gifts. The fluorescent lights behind her buzzed and flickered, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. It was late November, and the cold had settled into the city like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Grace was 22 years old, but her eyes carried the weight of someone who had lived much longer. She worked double shifts at a diner downtown, scraping together just enough to cover her tiny studio apartment, and on days like this to buy treats for the kids at St. Mary's Home for Children, the same place that had raised her after her mother died. She could still see it sometimes, when she closed her eyes. The memory never really left. She had been 7 years old, holding her mother's cold hand on a freezing street corner, watching the light fade from her eyes. They had been homeless for 3 months. Her mother had been too proud to beg, too sick to work, and too stubborn to ask for help until it was too late. Hunger and cold had taken her right there on the sidewalk, while people walked past like they were invisible. Grace shook her head, trying to push the memory away. She shifted the bags in her arms and started walking toward the bus stop. That's when she saw her. An elderly woman sat slumped against the brick wall of a closed pharmacy, her back pressed against the cold stone. She wore a thin cotton dress, frayed and patched in multiple places, barely enough to keep out the chill. Her feet were bare, pale and mottled with red from the cold. Her face was slack, eyes staring at nothing, and there was a smear of dried porridge around her mouth, like someone had fed her hours ago and forgotten to wipe her face. Grace stopped walking. The woman didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there, breathing shallow breaths that came out in small white clouds. Grace's chest tightened. She thought about the $23 left in her wallet, just enough to cover her rent payment tomorrow. She thought about the kids waiting for their treats. She thought about her own empty fridge. She took one step forward, then stopped. It's not your problem, she told herself. You can't save everyone. But then the woman's head tilted slightly, and for just a moment, Grace saw her mother's face. The same hollow eyes, the same defeated posture, the same invisible plea for help that no one had answered. Grace felt something crack open inside her chest. She knelt down beside the woman and carefully pulled a small packaged muffin from one of the bags. Here, she said softly, holding it out. It's not much, but it's warm. The woman didn't respond. Her eyes remained distant, unfocused. Grace set the muffin down beside her and stood up, ready to leave. At least you tried, she thought. That's more than most people do. But as she turned to walk away, the image of her mother's final moments flashed through her mind again, sharper this time, more vivid. The way her mother's fingers had gone limp in hers, the way the world had kept moving while hers stood still. Grace stopped. She turned back around. "Ma'am," she said, her voice a little louder now. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman's lips moved, forming words that didn't quite make it into sound. Then suddenly, tears began streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "David," the woman whispered, her voice cracked and broken. "David, where's David?" Grace knelt down again, this time closer. "Who's David? Is he your family?" The woman just kept crying, rocking slightly back and forth, her thin arms wrapped around herself, trying to hold in warmth that wasn't there. Grace looked around. The street was nearly empty. A few cars passed by, their headlights sweeping over them before disappearing into the distance. No one stopped. No one even slowed down. She thought about her rent. She thought about her job. She thought about how hard it was just to keep herself afloat. Then she thought about her mother, alone on that sidewalk, waiting for help that never came. Grace made her decision. "Okay," she said quietly, more to herself than to the woman. "Okay, you're coming with me." She set down her grocery bags and gently helped the woman to her feet. The woman was lighter than she expected, fragile as a bird. Grace wrapped her own coat around the woman's shoulders and picked up her bags with one hand, supporting the woman with the other. As they began to walk slowly down the street, Grace didn't notice the figure standing in the shadows of the alley behind them, a tall man with broad shoulders and a weathered face, watching them with eyes full of something that looked like both relief and shame. The man stepped forward slightly, as if to follow, then stopped himself. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He watched as Grace and the elderly woman disappeared around the corner, and then he turned and walked away in the opposite direction, his head hung low. Grace supported the woman's weight as they made their way toward the bus stop, the cold wind pushing against them. She didn't have a plan, she didn't have extra money, she didn't even have extra space in her tiny apartment, but she had made a choice, and sometimes, that's all that matters. Grace's apartment was barely big enough for one person, let alone two. It was a studio on the third floor of an old building, one room that served as bedroom, living room and kitchen all at once, with a bathroom the size of a closet. The paint was peeling, the radiator clanged and hissed, and the single window overlooked a brick wall. But it was hers, and it was warm. She helped the woman inside and sat her down on the only chair in the room, a worn armchair she had found on the street corner 2 years ago. The woman's eyes wandered around the small space, still distant and confused. "Let me get you some clean clothes," Grace said gently. She pulled out her only spare set of pajamas, soft flannel pants, and a long-sleeved shirt, and helped the woman change. The woman's arms were thin, her skin papery and marked with bruises. Grace tried not to stare. She had seen poverty before. She had lived it, but something about this woman's frailty made her heart ache in a way she hadn't felt in years. After the woman was dressed, Grace heated up a can of soup on her small stove and brought it over in a chipped bowl. "Here," she said, kneeling down in front of the chair. "Eat slowly, okay?" The woman took the spoon with trembling hands and began to eat. Grace watched her carefully, making sure she didn't choke. When the bowl was empty, the woman looked up at Grace with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Grace felt her throat tighten. "You're welcome." That night, Grace gave the woman her bed, and slept on the floor with a thin blanket and a pillow. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had just gotten herself into. "What am I doing?" she thought. "I can barely take care of myself." But when she heard the woman's soft, steady breathing from the bed above her, something in Grace's chest settled. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so alone. The next morning, Grace woke early and made breakfast. 2 pieces of toast with butter and jam, split between them. The woman ate slowly, still looking confused, but calmer than the night before. "Ma'am," Grace said gently, sitting across from her at the small table, "can you tell me your name?" The woman blinked a few times, her brow furrowing. "Helen," she said finally. "Helen Harper." "Helen," Grace repeated, smiling softly. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Grace." Helen nodded slowly, as if trying to remember something just out of reach. "Helen, do you remember where you live, or how you ended up on that street?" Helen's face crumpled with confusion. I don't know. I was looking for someone. David. I need to find David." "Who's David?" Grace asked. "Is he your son? Your husband?" Helen's eyes filled with tears again. "David," she whispered. "My boy. Where is he?" Grace reached across the table and took Helen's hand. "We'll find him, okay? I promise." Over the next few days, Grace did everything she could to locate Helen's family. She called hospitals, shelters, and the police. She posted on community boards and asked neighbors if they recognized Helen's description, but no one had any answers. No one had reported her missing. It was as if Helen Harper had simply vanished from the world, and no one had noticed. Grace sat on her apartment floor one evening, exhausted and frustrated, staring at her phone. She had spent hours searching, and it had led nowhere. Maybe she doesn't have anyone, Grace thought. Maybe David is gone. Maybe she's been alone for a long time. She looked over at Helen, who was sitting in the armchair, staring blankly at the wall. Grace felt a pang of sadness, so deep it took her breath away. "Okay," Grace said quietly to herself. "If no one's coming for you, then you'll stay here. With me." The neighbors talked, of course. They always did. Mrs. Chen from downstairs asked nosy questions. "Who is that woman living with you? Is she your grandmother?" "Just someone who needed help," Grace replied, keeping her voice polite but firm. Mr. Rodriguez, from across the hall, gave her disapproving looks. You know you're not supposed to have extra people living here, right? The lease says one person only. Grace ignored him. She had made her choice, and she wasn't going to back down now. Over the months that followed, something unexpected happened. Helen began to settle in. Some days were harder than others. There were moments when Helen didn't recognize Grace, when she called her by different names, or became agitated and confused. On those days, Grace held her hand and spoke to her softly until the storm passed, but on the good days, Helen was surprisingly lucid. She helped Grace fold laundry. She hummed old songs while washing dishes. She even cooked simple meals, scrambled eggs, toast and soup, things she remembered from muscle memory even when her mind was clouded. Grace found herself looking forward to coming home. For so long, her apartment had felt like just a place to sleep between shifts, but now it felt like something more. It felt like a home. One evening, about a year after Grace had found her, Helen was standing at the stove, stirring a pot of soup. Grace sat at the table, watching her. You remind me of my mother, Grace said quietly. Helen turned, her eyes soft and warm. Do I? Grace nodded. She used to hum like that when she cooked. I haven't heard that sound in a long time. Helen smiled, and set down the spoon. She walked over and placed a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. You're a good girl, Grace. A very good girl. Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. She reached up and squeezed Helen's hand. Thank you. But even in those tender moments, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that Helen was hiding something. Whenever Grace asked about her past, about David, or about where she had lived before, Helen would change the subject or claim she couldn't remember. And late at night, when Helen thought Grace was asleep, Grace would hear her whispering the same name over and over again. David. My David. The months passed slowly but steadily. Grace and Helen settled into a rhythm, a life built on small routines and quiet companionship. Grace worked her shifts at the diner, came home exhausted, and found comfort in Helen's presence. Some days Helen was lucid and helpful, cooking simple meals and humming old songs. Other days she was lost in confusion, calling out for David, wandering the apartment in distress. But they managed. Together they managed. Grace had long since stopped searching for Helen's family. After months of dead ends and unanswered questions, she had accepted that Helen was hers now, her family, her responsibility, her choice. The neighbors had stopped their judgmental whispers. Mrs. Chen from downstairs now occasionally brought up soup. Mr. Rodriguez still grumbled about lease violations, but he never actually reported them. Life wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And then, 1 year after Grace had found Helen on that cold sidewalk, everything changed. It was a mild autumn afternoon, when Grace noticed the moving truck parked outside their building. She didn't pay much attention at first. People moved in and out all the time. But as she climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, arms full of groceries, she heard voices and the sound of furniture being dragged across the floor. Someone was moving into apartment 3B, the one right next to hers. Grace unlocked her door and stepped inside, where Helen was sitting in her usual chair, knitting quietly. We're getting a new neighbor, Grace said, setting the groceries on the counter. Helen looked up, her expression distant. That's nice, dear. Grace didn't think much of it. New neighbors came and went. This would be no different. But she was wrong. 2 weeks after the new neighbor moved in, Grace found something strange. She opened her apartment door one morning to head to work and nearly tripped over a bag sitting right outside. Inside were fresh groceries, vegetables, bread, milk, even a small box of chocolates. There was no note, no name. Grace looked up and down the hallway, confused. Hello? She called out. Did someone leave this here by mistake? No answer. She brought the bag inside, frowning. That's weird, she muttered to herself. Helen looked up from her tea. What's weird? Someone left groceries outside our door, Grace said, unpacking the items onto the counter. But I have no idea who. Helen's hands paused in their knitting, just for a moment, before continuing. How kind of them. Grace shrugged. Yeah, I guess. But it's strange, right? A few days later, it happened again. This time, the bag contained warm blankets and a new winter coat, exactly Grace's size. Then came a small space heater, then new clothes for Helen, then more groceries, better quality than Grace could ever afford. Grace started asking around the building. She knocked on doors, described the mysterious gifts, asked if anyone knew who was leaving them. No one admitted to knowing anything. But Mrs. Chen from downstairs gave her a knowing look. "Maybe it's your new neighbor in 3B, she said with a slight smile. "I've seen him carrying bags in the hallway, late at night." Grace's curiosity intensified. Grace decided she needed to catch this mysterious benefactor in the act. One evening, she sat by her door, listening carefully. Around 10 o'clock at night, she heard soft footsteps in the hallway. The sound of something being set down gently on the floor. Grace yanked open her door. A tall man in his mid-30s stood there, frozen in the act of placing a bag outside her apartment. He had dark hair that was slightly disheveled, tired eyes with dark circles underneath, and the kind of face that looked like it carried the weight of the world. His clothes were nice, expensive, even, but worn in a way that suggested he cared little about appearances. "Excuse me," Grace said, crossing her arms. The man's eyes widened in panic. He straightened up quickly, taking a step back. "Are you the one who's been leaving these things?" Grace asked. The man hesitated, looking like he wanted to bolt back into his apartment. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, that's me." "Why?" Grace asked, studying him carefully. There was something familiar about him, though she couldn't place it. "I don't even know you." The man shifted his weight uncomfortably. His eyes kept darting to Grace's apartment door, as if he was looking for something or someone. I saw you. With the elderly woman. I thought you could use some help." "How did you see us?" Grace pressed. "Have you been watching us?" "No," the man said quickly, then seemed to realize how defensive he sounded. "I mean, I just noticed, when I was moving in, that's all." Grace didn't believe him. There was something he wasn't saying, something in the way his hands trembled slightly, the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "What's your name?" she asked. "Michael," he said, without hesitation this time. "Michael Taylor." Grace extended her hand. "Grace, and thank you for the gifts, Michael. But you really don't have to keep doing this. We're managing okay." Michael looked at her outstretched hand for a long moment, before shaking it briefly. His palm was sweaty. "I want to help, please, just let me." There was something almost desperate in his voice that made Grace pause. "Okay," she said slowly, "but at least let me thank you properly. Come over for dinner sometime." Michael's face went completely white. "No," he said quickly, taking another step back. "No, I can't. I'm sorry, I have to go." Before Grace could say another word, he turned and practically ran into his apartment, shutting the door firmly behind him. Grace stood in the hallway, staring at his closed door, her mind spinning. What was that about? Why does he seem so afraid? The gifts continued. Every few days, something new would appear outside Grace's door, always useful, always thoughtful, always expensive. Grace tried to refuse them, tried to return them, but Michael was like a ghost. He came and went at odd hours, always managing to avoid running into her. But Grace noticed something else, too, something that made her uneasy. Whenever Helen heard footsteps in the hallway that sounded like Michael's, she would stop whatever she was doing. Her whole body would go still, her head turning toward the door, like a bird listening for a predator. And her face would take on an expression Grace had never seen before, a mixture of longing, sadness, and something that looked almost like fear. "Helen." Grace would ask, "Are you okay?" And Helen would blink, as if coming back from somewhere far away. "Yes, dear, I'm fine." But Grace knew she wasn't fine. One afternoon, about a month after Michael had moved in, it finally happened. Grace had left the apartment door slightly ajar while she carried in groceries from multiple trips. On her third trip up the stairs, she heard voices in the hallway. She stopped at the landing, her arms full of bags, and peered around the corner. Helen was standing in the hallway. She must have wandered out while Grace was downstairs, and Michael was there too, standing just outside his apartment door, frozen like a deer in headlights. They were face to face, barely 6 feet apart. Grace held her breath, not daring to move. For a long moment, neither Helen nor Michael said anything. They just stared at each other in complete silence. Helen's eyes were clear, not confused, not lost, just deeply, profoundly sad. Michael's face had gone pale, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He looked like he wanted to say something, his mouth opening slightly, but no words came out. Helen took one small step forward. Michael immediately took a step back, his eyes wide with something that looked like panic. Helen stopped. She didn't try to move closer again, she just stood there, looking at him with an expression that broke Grace's heart, a look of such deep resignation and sorrow that Grace felt tears prick at her own eyes. Michael's jaw worked, like he was trying to force words out, but couldn't. His eyes were beginning to glisten with unshed tears. Then without a word, he turned sharply and walked into his apartment, closing the door quietly behind him. Not slamming it, not running, just leaving. Helen stood there for another moment, staring at his closed door. A single tear rolled down her cheek. Then she turned and slowly walked back toward Grace's apartment, her shoulders slumped, her head bowed. Grace quickly moved, pretending she had just come up the stairs. "Helen, there you are. I was worried you'd wandered off." Helen looked at her with those clear, sad eyes. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I just needed some air." Grace guided her gently back inside, her mind racing with questions. What just happened? Why didn't they speak to each other? And why does Helen look like her heart is breaking? That evening, after dinner, Grace tried to bring it up. "Helen," she said carefully, sitting down across from her, "I saw you in the hallway today, with our neighbor." Helen's hand stilled on the blanket she was folding. She didn't look up. "Who is he, Helen?" Grace asked gently. "Why did you look at him like that?" Helen was quiet for so long that Grace thought she might not answer. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes we see people who remind us of those we've lost." "But please, Grace," Helen interrupted, finally looking up. Her eyes were pleading. "Please don't ask me about this. Some wounds are better left alone." Grace wanted to push, wanted to demand answers, but something in Helen's expression stopped her. There was a wall there, a wall of pain and shame and secrets that Helen wasn't ready to tear down. "Okay," Grace said softly. "I won't push, but if you ever want to talk about it." "Thank you, dear," Helen said, returning to her folding. "You're very kind," but Grace couldn't let it go entirely. Over the next few weeks, she found herself watching both Helen and Michael more carefully. She noticed how Michael's gifts became more frequent, more expensive. A new coffee maker, a thick rug, boxes and boxes of groceries. She noticed how he timed his comings and goings to avoid running into them. She noticed how Helen would sometimes stand by their apartment door, just listening, as if hoping to hear Michael's footsteps, and she noticed how they never spoke to each other again, even when they passed in the hallway. They would both freeze, look at each other with heartbreaking sadness, and then move on without a word. It was like watching two ghosts haunting the same space, unable to reach each other. Grace knew there was a story here, a painful, complicated story, and she was determined to find out what it was. The truth came to Grace by accident. It was a cold evening in late autumn, almost 2 months after Michael had moved in. Grace came home late from a double shift, exhausted and barely able to keep her eyes open. She climbed the stairs slowly, her whole body aching. When she reached the 3rd floor, she found another package outside her door, a large box wrapped in brown paper. Grace sighed and bent down to pick it up. It was heavier than she expected, and as she lifted it, the bottom gave way. Items spilled out onto the hallway floor with a clatter. "Damn it," Grace muttered, setting down the torn box and kneeling to gather everything up. Canned goods, pasta, a new blanket, and several pieces of mail that must have gotten mixed in accidentally. Grace picked up the mail, intending to slip it back under Michael's door, when her eyes caught on the name printed across the top envelope. "David Harper, Apartment 3B. Grace froze, her heart stopped beating for a moment, then started again, pounding hard against her ribs. David Harper. The name Helen whispered in her sleep every night. The name she called out during her confused episodes. The son she had been searching for. Grace stared at the envelope, her hands beginning to shake. Michael isn't Michael, he's David, he's Helen's son. All the pieces suddenly clicked into place. The way he had looked at Helen in the hallway. The desperate quality in his voice when he insisted on helping them. The guilt that seemed to radiate off him in waves, the way Helen looked at him with such profound sadness, and the way neither of them spoke to each other. Grace sat back on her heels, the envelope clutched in her trembling hands, her mind reeling. He's been here all along, living right next door, giving us things, watching over his own mother, but too afraid or too ashamed to actually face her. Grace felt a confusing mixture of emotions crash over her: anger, sympathy, frustration, sadness. Why? She thought. Why would he do this? What happened between them that was so terrible he can't even speak to her? She looked at Helen's closed bedroom door, then at Michael's, David's apartment across the hall. And why is Helen protecting him? Why won't she tell me the truth? Grace carefully gathered up the rest of the spilled items and David's mail. She stood up slowly, her legs shaky, and slipped the mail back under his door. Then she went inside her own apartment and sat down at the kitchen table, her mind spinning. She had promised Helen she wouldn't interfere, but this was bigger than that promise now. This family was broken, and they were both suffering in silence, too proud or too afraid to reach out to each other. Someone had to do something, and Grace realized that someone was going to have to be her. Tomorrow she would confront David, she would demand the truth, and this time he wasn't going to be able to run away. Because this couldn't continue. This silent, painful dance between mother and son, it had to end. One way or another. Over the next week, the gifts kept coming. But now they were different, more expensive, more deliberate. A brand new coffee maker appeared outside Grace's door. Then a thick, warm rug for the apartment. Then a box filled with fresh groceries, steaks, vegetables, pasta, things Grace hadn't been able to afford in months. Grace accepted them, but each time she did, her resentment grew. He thinks he can buy his way out of this, she thought. He thinks money can fix what he did. She wanted to refuse the gifts. She wanted to throw them back in his face, but she also knew that Helen needed them. Grace's paycheck was barely enough to cover rent and food for 2 people. Without Michael's help, they would have been struggling even more. So she took the gifts, but she didn't thank him for them. And every time she saw him in the hallway, she stared at him with cold, unforgiving eyes. Michael seemed to notice. He stopped trying to make small talk. He avoided her gaze and hurried past her whenever they crossed paths. But the gifts didn't stop. One evening, Grace found a thick envelope outside her door. Inside was $500 in cash, and a handwritten note, "For rent and groceries. Please don't refuse this." Grace crumpled the note in her hand, her anger flaring. Who does he think he is? She knocked on his door, hard and insistent. "Michael, open up." There was no answer. She knocked again, louder this time. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Still nothing. Grace stood there for a long moment, her chest heaving, her fists clenched. Then she turned and walked back to her apartment, slamming the door behind her. But as she stood in her small kitchen, staring at the envelope of money on the table, she felt something shift inside her. He's hiding something, she thought. And I'm going to find out what it is. Grace waited until late one evening, when she knew Michael would be coming home from wherever he spent his days. She stood outside her apartment door, arms crossed, waiting. Finally she heard footsteps on the stairs. Michael appeared at the top of the landing, carrying a bag of groceries. When he saw Grace standing there, he stopped. "We need to talk," Grace said, her voice steady and firm. Michael's face went pale. "I don't think that's a good idea." "I don't care what you think," Grace said, stepping toward him. "You've been leaving gifts outside my door for months. You've been watching us, and I know who you are." Michael's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" "Don't lie to me," Grace said, her voice rising. "I saw the mail. I know your real name. David Harper." Michael's face crumpled. He looked like he might collapse right there in the hallway. "You're Helen's son," Grace continued, her voice shaking with anger. "You're the person she's been crying for every single night. And you've been living right next door this entire time." Michael opened his mouth but no words came out. "Why?" Grace demanded. "Why would you leave her on the street like that? Why would you abandon your own mother?" "I didn't." Michael's voice broke. "It's not that simple." "Then explain it to me," Grace said, "because right now all I see is a man who left his sick mother to die alone on a sidewalk." Michael's hands were trembling. He set down the groceries and ran a hand through his hair, his face twisted in anguish. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "You don't know what it was like. Then tell me, Grace said. Make me understand. But before Michael could respond, a loud crash echoed from inside Grace's apartment. Both of them froze. Helen, Grace whispered. She spun around and ran to her door, throwing it open. Michael was right behind her. Inside, Helen was lying on the floor, her body convulsing, her eyes rolled back in her head. "Oh my God," Grace gasped, dropping to her knees beside her. "Helen, can you hear me?" But Helen didn't respond. Her breathing was shallow, her skin pale and clammy. Michael pushed past Grace and scooped Helen up in his arms. "We need to get her to the hospital. Now." Grace grabbed her phone and keys, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped them. "My car's out front. Come on." Michael carried Helen down the stairs, moving faster than Grace would have thought possible. Grace ran ahead, unlocking her car and throwing open the back door. Michael laid Helen gently across the back seat, cradling her head in his lap. Grace jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine, her heart pounding in her chest. As they sped through the dark streets toward the hospital, Grace glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Michael's face, streaked with tears, his lips moving in a silent prayer. And for the first time since she had learned the truth, Grace felt her anger waver. "Maybe there's more to this story than I thought." The emergency room was a blur of white lights and hurried footsteps. Grace stood in the waiting area, her arms wrapped around herself, watching as nurses and doctors rushed Helen away on a gurney. Michael was right beside her, his face ashen, his hands still trembling from carrying his mother's limp body. "She's going to be okay," Grace said, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. "They'll take care of her." Michael didn't respond. He just stood there staring at the double doors that Helen had disappeared through, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. A nurse approached them, clipboard in hand. "Are you family?" "Yes," Michael said immediately, his voice hoarse. "I'm her son." The nurse nodded and began asking questions. Helen's full name, her age, any known medical conditions, current medications. Michael answered everything mechanically, his eyes never leaving those doors. When the nurse asked what had happened, Grace spoke up. "We found her on the floor. She was shaking, and her breathing was really shallow. I think she might have taken too much of her medication." The nurse's expression grew more serious. "How much did she take?" Grace's stomach dropped. "I don't know. I didn't see her take anything. I just found the empty bottle on the counter afterward." The nurse made a note and hurried off, leaving Grace and Michael alone in the waiting area. The silence between them was suffocating. Grace looked at Michael, really looked at him, and saw a man on the verge of falling apart. His shoulders were hunched, his hands gripping the edge of a plastic chair, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. His eyes were red and swollen, and he kept swallowing hard, like he was trying to hold back a sob. "Michael," Grace said softly. He didn't look at her. "David," she corrected. That got his attention. He turned to her, and the look in his eyes nearly broke her heart. It was pure, unfiltered pain. "Don't call me that," he whispered. "Please." Grace crossed her arms. "Why not? It's your name, isn't it?" "David," because that's who he was, no matter what name he used, closed his eyes and pressed his palms against his face. "You don't understand. Then help me understand," Grace said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Because right now, all I know is that you left your mother on a freezing street corner, and then spent a year watching her from a distance instead of taking her home." David's hands dropped, and he looked at Grace with an expression so full of shame that it made her chest ache. "I didn't mean to leave her," he said, his voice breaking. "I swear to God, I didn't mean to." "Then what happened?" Grace asked. "Why did you do it?" David shook his head, tears spilling down his cheeks. "I was drowning. I was so far underwater I couldn't see the surface anymore. And I thought maybe she'd be better off without me." Grace's anger wavered. She wanted to stay mad at him. He deserved her anger, but the raw pain in his voice made it hard to hold on to. "Tell me everything," she said quietly, sitting down in the chair beside him. "From the beginning." David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, and took a shaky breath. "It started about 2 years ago. I had my own business," David began, his voice hollow, "a small construction company. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I was doing okay for a while, paying the bills, keeping food on the table, taking care of my mom." He paused, his hands clenching into fists on his knees. But then I made some bad decisions. I took on a project that was too big, too expensive. I borrowed money I couldn't pay back. And when the project fell through, I lost everything. Grace listened silently, her eyes fixed on his face. I tried to fix it, David continued. I really did. I worked 3 jobs, took on side gigs, did everything I could think of. But the debt just kept piling up. And then my mom got worse. He looked up at the ceiling, blinking back more tears. She was diagnosed with Alzheimer's a few years ago. At first it wasn't too bad. She'd forget little things, where she put her keys, what she had for breakfast. But then it got worse. She started wandering off, forgetting who I was. Sometimes she'd wake up in the middle of the night screaming because she didn't recognize her own house. Grace felt a lump forming in her throat. I tried to take care of her at home, David said, but I couldn't afford a caregiver, and I couldn't afford to put her in a facility. So it was just me, and I was barely home because I was working all the time, trying to pay off my debts and keep a roof over our heads. He rubbed his face with both hands, his voice growing quieter. And then one night, I came home after a 16-hour shift, and the house was a disaster. She had left the stove on, and nearly started a fire. There was food smeared on the walls. She had torn up all the bills I had been trying to organize. And when I walked in, she looked at me like I was a stranger, like I was someone who had broken into her house. David's voice cracked. I tried to calm her down, but she got so upset. She started hitting me, screaming at me to get out. And I snapped. Grace's breath caught in her throat. I didn't hurt her, David said quickly, as if reading her thoughts. I would never hurt her, but I yelled at her. I yelled so loud that she started crying. And when I saw the look on her face, the fear, I hated myself. He buried his face in his hands. I couldn't do it anymore, he whispered. I was so tired, so angry, so broken, and I thought, what kind of life is this for her? What kind of son am I? Grace reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the touch, but didn't pull away. What happened after that? She asked gently. David took a deep shuddering breath. 3 months later, things got even worse. I had lost 2 of my jobs by then, David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. I was down to 1 part-time gig that barely paid anything. We had no money, no food. I was selling everything I owned just to keep the lights on. He stared at the floor, his eyes distant. One night, I made a pot of porridge. It was the last of the food we had. I poured it into 2 bowls, one for me, one for her. But when I brought hers to her, she was having one of her episodes. She didn't recognize me. She thought I was trying to poison her. David's hands started to shake again. She knocked the bowl out of my hands. The porridge spilled all over the floor, and I stood there, staring at it. That was our last meal, and it was gone. Grace's eyes filled with tears. I was so hungry, David said, his voice breaking. I hadn't eaten in 2 days, and I was so angry. Not at her. I knew it wasn't her fault, but at everything. At the world, at myself. At the fact that I couldn't even afford to feed my own mother. He wiped his eyes roughly. That was the night I gave up. Grace's heart clenched. I couldn't take her to a nursing home. I didn't have the money. I couldn't leave her at a hospital. They'd just send her back to me. So I took her to the grocery store. I left her sitting on the sidewalk outside, and I told myself I was just going to step away for a few minutes to clear my head. David's voice dropped to barely a whisper. But when I came back, you were already there. You were helping her, talking to her, and I saw the way she looked at you, like you were someone safe, someone kind, someone who could give her what I couldn't. He looked up at Grace, his eyes pleading. So I hid. I watched you take her to your apartment, and I told myself it was temporary, just until I got back on my feet. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and the longer I stayed away, the harder it got to come back. Grace stared at him, her mind reeling. So you just left her with me? I know how it sounds, David said desperately. I know it was wrong, but I saw how happy she was with you, how well you took care of her, and I thought, maybe she's better off this way. Maybe I'm not the son she needs. That wasn't your choice to make, Grace said, her voice rising. She's your mother, David. She deserves to know the truth. I know, David said, his voice breaking. I know, but I was so ashamed. And the longer I waited, the worse it got. How was I supposed to just walk up to your door and say, hey, by the way, I'm the son who abandoned her. Can I have her back now? Grace shook her head, anger and sympathy warring inside her. So instead, you moved in next door and played Secret Santa. I wanted to help, David said. I got a new job, a good one. I started making money again, and I wanted to give back to you for everything you did for her. But I didn't know how to face you. I didn't know how to face her. You should have told me, Grace said. You should have told both of us. I was going to, David said. I swear I was. But every time I tried, I'd see her through the window, laughing with you, and I'd lose my nerve. She looked so happy, and I thought, if I come back into her life, I'll just ruin it again. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. You're an idiot. David let out a choked laugh. I know. She's been calling your name every night, Grace said. Did you know that? She cries for you. She asks where you are, and you were right there the whole time. David covered his face with his hands and sobbed. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Grace didn't say anything. She just sat there, watching him fall apart, feeling her own heart break a little more with every word. They sat in silence for what felt like hours. The waiting room slowly emptied out as other patients came and went. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, sterile glow. Finally a doctor emerged from the double doors. Family of Helen Harper. Both Grace and David shot to their feet. The doctor looked between them, then settled his gaze on David. Are you her son? Yes, David said immediately. Is she okay? The doctor's expression was serious but calm. She's stable. We pumped her stomach, and gave her activated charcoal to absorb the remaining medication in her system. She had taken nearly 3 times her prescribed dose of her anxiety medication. Another hour, and it could have been much worse. David's knees buckled. Grace caught his arm, holding him upright. Is it? David's voice was barely audible. Is it my fault? Did seeing me cause this? The doctor hesitated. It's hard to say. Patients with Alzheimer's can have unpredictable reactions to stress or emotional triggers. Seeing someone from her past, especially someone she's been searching for, could have caused confusion and panic. It's possible she took the extra medication to calm herself down, and didn't realize how much she was taking. David made a sound like a wounded animal. But the doctor continued, she's going to be okay. She's awake now, and she's asking for both of you. Grace felt her heart skip. Both of us? The doctor nodded. She's been asking for someone named Grace and someone named David. David looked at Grace, his eyes wide and terrified. I can't go in there. Yes, you can, Grace said firmly. She grabbed his hand and squeezed it. You have to. She needs you. What if she doesn't want to see me? David whispered. What if she hates me? Then you'll deal with it, Grace said. But you owe her the truth, and you owe it to yourself to stop running. David stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay. The room was small and dimly lit, with machines beeping softly in the corners. Helen lay in the bed, looking impossibly small beneath the white sheets. Her hair was thin and gray against the pillow, her face pale and drawn. But her eyes were open, and they were clear. Grace entered first, moving slowly to the side of the bed. Hey Helen, she said softly. How are you feeling? Helen's lips curved into a faint smile. Like I've been hit by a truck. Her voice was weak but steady. Grace laughed, tears streaming down her face. You scared me half to death. I'm sorry, sweetheart, Helen said, reaching out a frail hand. Grace took it, squeezing gently. There's someone here to see you, Grace said, glancing back at the doorway. David stood just outside, frozen in place, his face a mask of fear and guilt. Come on, Grace said gently. It's okay. David took one hesitant step forward, then another. When he finally entered the room, Helen's eyes locked onto him. For a moment there was only silence. Then Helen's face crumpled, and she began to cry. David, she whispered. My David. David's legs gave out. He fell to his knees beside the bed, burying his face in the blankets. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Helen reached out with a trembling hand and placed it on his head, her fingers threading through his hair. She whispered, "It's okay, baby. It's okay. It's not okay." David sobbed, "I left you. I abandoned you. I'm the worst son in the world." "No," Helen said firmly, her voice stronger now. "No, you're not." David looked up at her, his face streaked with tears. "How can you say that, after everything I did?" Helen cupped his face in her hands, her own tears falling freely. "Because I know you, David. I know my boy, and I know you were hurting." "That's not an excuse," David said, his voice breaking. "Maybe not," Helen said, "but it's the truth, and I forgive you." David shook his head. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "Maybe not," Helen said again, a sad smile on her face. "But I'm giving it to you anyway, because that's what mothers do." David collapsed against the bed, sobbing so hard his whole body shook. Helen held him, running her fingers through his hair the way she must have done when he was a child. Grace stood off to the side, tears streaming down her own face, feeling like she was witnessing something sacred. After a long while, Helen looked up at Grace and reached out her other hand. "Come here, sweetheart." Grace moved closer, taking Helen's hand. "I need to apologize to you too," Helen said. "I've been such a burden, and you've been so good to me. Better than I deserved." "Don't say that," Grace said, shaking her head. "You were never a burden." "Yes, I was," Helen said gently. "But you took me in anyway. You gave me a home when no one else would. You treated me like family." Grace squeezed her hand. "Because you are family." Helen smiled through her tears. "You're a special person, Grace, a truly special person." David finally lifted his head, his face red and swollen. He looked at Grace, and for the first time she saw something other than shame in his eyes. She saw gratitude. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for everything you did for her, for everything you did for us." Grace nodded, unable to speak. David took a deep breath and turned back to his mother. "Mom, I want to make this right. I have money now. A good job. I can take care of you properly. I can." "David," Helen interrupted gently, "I don't need your money, I just need my son." David's face crumpled again, but this time he was smiling through the tears. "You have me, Mom. I promise. You have me." Helen looked between David and Grace, her eyes soft and full of love. "I think," she said slowly, "that we all need each other." David looked at Grace, a question in his eyes. Grace felt her heart swell. She thought about the past year, the struggles, the sleepless nights, the moments of doubt, but she also thought about the laughter, the warmth, the feeling of not being alone anymore. "Yeah," Grace said softly, "I think we do." David sat alone in the hospital waiting room, his head in his hands, the memories flooding back like a dam had broken inside him. He could still see that night, so clearly, the night everything fell apart. The apartment had been cold, the heat had been shut off 2 weeks earlier because David couldn't pay the bill. He had wrapped his mother in every blanket they owned, but it wasn't enough. She shivered constantly, her frail body unable to stay warm. David stood in the tiny kitchen, staring at the pot of porridge he had just made. It was the last of their food. The very last. He had scraped together every penny he could find, checked under couch cushions, dug through old coat pockets, even returned empty bottles for the deposit money. And all of it had bought him enough rice to make 1 pot of porridge. He poured it into 2 bowls, one for him, one for his mother. His stomach ached, he hadn't eaten in 2 days. But he couldn't let her go hungry, he wouldn't. He carried her bowl to the living room, where she sat wrapped in blankets, staring blankly at the wall. "Mom," he said softly, kneeling down in front of her, "I made you something to eat." She didn't respond at first. Her eyes were distant, lost somewhere inside her own mind. "Mom," David tried again, holding the bowl out to her. "Please eat." Helen turned to look at him, but there was no recognition in her eyes. She looked at him like he was a stranger, like he was a threat. "Get away from me," she said, her voice sharp and frightened. "Who are you? What do you want?" David's heart sank. "Mom, it's me, it's David. I don't know you," Helen said, her voice rising in panic. "Get out of my house." "Mom, please." She swung her arm out, knocking the bowl from his hands. The porridge splattered across the floor, spreading in a wide steaming puddle. David stared at it, their last meal. Gone. Something inside him snapped. "Do you have any idea what I just went through to get that?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the walls. "Do you have any idea how hard I've been working to keep us alive?" Helen flinched, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry," David said immediately, his anger deflating into exhaustion. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to yell." But Helen was crying now, her whole body trembling. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me." David sank to the floor beside her, his head in his hands. He was so tired, so impossibly tired. And he didn't know how much longer he could keep doing this. "I can't do this anymore," he whispered. "I just can't." 3 months passed. 3 long brutal months. David lost another job. The eviction notice came, the debt collectors started calling every day, and his mother got worse. So much worse. She wandered out of the apartment twice and got lost. Once the police found her 3 miles away, sitting on a park bench in the rain, asking strangers if they'd seen her son. Another time, a neighbor brought her back after finding her trying to break into someone else's apartment, convinced it was hers. David stopped sleeping. He was too afraid she'd wander off again. He started locking the doors at night and hiding the keys, but that only made her more agitated. She would bang on the door screaming to be let out, convinced she was being held prisoner. David felt like he was losing his mind, and then came the worst night. David came home after another failed job interview to find the apartment in chaos. His mother had torn through every drawer, every cabinet, throwing papers and clothes everywhere. She was looking for something. What? David didn't know. Maybe she didn't know either. On the stove, a pot was boiling over, the water hissing as it hit the burner. She had turned it on and forgotten about it. The kitchen was filled with smoke. David rushed to turn it off, his heart pounding. Another few minutes and the whole place could have caught fire. He turned to his mother, who was standing in the middle of the living room, looking around in confusion. "Mom, what were you doing?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. She looked at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know." David felt something break inside him. He couldn't keep her safe. He couldn't afford to put her in a home. He couldn't even feed her properly. And she didn't even know who he was half the time. What kind of life was this? For either of them. That night, David made his decision. He waited until his mother had calmed down, then helped her into her coat. "Come on, Mom," he said gently. "Let's go for a walk." "A walk?" Helen said, her face brightening a little. "That sounds nice." David drove her to the grocery store on the other side of town, far enough that she wouldn't find her way back, but close enough that someone would find her quickly. He told himself he just needed a break, just a few hours to think, to breathe, to figure out what to do next. He helped her sit down on the sidewalk outside the store, wrapping his own coat around her shoulders. "Wait here, Mom," he said. "I'll be right back." She nodded, her eyes already drifting. David walked around the corner and stood in the alley, leaning against the cold brick wall. His hands were shaking, his chest felt tight, he couldn't breathe. He told himself he would only stay for a few minutes, just long enough to calm down, then he'd go back and get her. But as he stood there, he heard a voice. A young woman's voice, soft and kind. "Ma'am, are you okay?" David peered around the corner and saw a young black woman kneeling beside his mother, holding out a piece of food. His mother didn't respond, just stared blankly ahead. The young woman stood up, as if to leave. And David felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment, but then she stopped. She turned back around, and she knelt down again, this time with more determination. David watched as the young woman spoke to his mother, her voice gentle and patient. He watched as she helped his mother to her feet and wrapped her own coat around her, and he watched as they walked away together, disappearing down the street. David stood frozen in that alley, tears streaming down his face, and then he turned and walked in the opposite direction. David had spent the next year rebuilding his life. He got a job at a construction company, starting from the bottom, working long hours, proving himself day after day. Within 6 months he was promoted to foreman. Within a year he had saved enough money to start his own company again, this time, doing it right. But no matter how much success he found, he couldn't stop thinking about his mother. He couldn't stop thinking about Grace. He drove past Grace's apartment building almost every night, just to make sure they were okay. He left gifts outside the door, telling himself it was the least he could do. And when the apartment next door became available, he rented it without hesitation. He told himself he was just keeping an eye on them, making sure they were safe. But deep down he knew the truth. He wanted to be close to his mother, even if he couldn't face her. He wanted to see Grace, the woman who had done what he couldn't, who had given his mother the care and love she deserved. And every day his guilt grew heavier. David opened his eyes, the hospital room coming back into focus. Helen was asleep now, her breathing steady and calm. Grace sat beside the bed, holding Helen's hand, her eyes closed. David stood up slowly and walked over to Grace. "Hey," he said softly. Grace opened her eyes and looked up at him. "Hey, I need to ask you something," David said. Grace raised an eyebrow. "What?" David took a deep breath. "I want to make this right. I want to take care of my mom the way I should have from the beginning. But I also know that you've been her family for the past year, and I don't want to take that away from her, or from you." Grace tilted her head, waiting. "So I'm asking," David said, his voice earnest. Would you consider staying with us, being part of our family?" "I know it's a lot to ask, but yes," Grace said, cutting him off. David blinked. "Yes," Grace smiled. "Yes, I'd like that." David felt tears prick at his eyes again. "Really? Really?" Grace said. "Helen's been my family for a year. I'm not going to walk away from her now, or from you." David let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you so much." Grace stood up and looked him in the eye. "But let me be clear about something. If you ever abandon her again, if you ever hurt her like that again, I will make your life a living hell. Understood?" David nodded quickly. "Understood." Grace's expression softened. "Good, now let's figure out how to make this work." The house was bigger than anything Grace had ever lived in. It had 3 bedrooms, a real kitchen with an island, and a backyard with a garden that Helen tended to every morning. David had bought it with the money from his new company, and he had insisted that Grace and Helen move in with him. Grace had hesitated at first. She wasn't used to accepting help, but Helen had squeezed her hand and said, "Please, sweetheart, let us do this." So Grace had agreed. The first few months were an adjustment. Grace had to get used to having her own bedroom, her own space. She had to get used to the idea that she didn't have to work herself to exhaustion anymore. David covered the bills, and he had even helped her enroll in community college so she could pursue her dream of becoming a nurse. Helen's condition had stabilized. The doctors had adjusted her medications, and with proper care and a calm, loving environment, her episodes became less frequent. She still had bad days, days when she didn't recognize them, days when she got confused and frightened. But there were more good days now, days when she laughed, days when she cooked breakfast for everyone, days when she sat in the garden, humming to herself, content and at peace. And David had changed. He was still quiet, still carried the weight of his guilt, but he was present. He showed up. He took his mother to her doctor's appointments. He helped Grace with her homework. He made sure everyone was taken care of. One evening the 3 of them sat together in the living room. Helen was in her favorite armchair, knitting a scarf. David was on the couch, reviewing blueprints for his latest project. And Grace was curled up in the other corner, a textbook open on her lap. "I've been thinking," Helen said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Both David and Grace looked up. "About what, Mom?" David asked. Helen set down her knitting and looked at both of them, her eyes clear and bright. "About how lucky I am." David's expression softened. "We're the lucky ones, Mom." "No," Helen said firmly. "I mean it. I don't remember everything that happened over the past few years. But I remember enough, and I know that I'm sitting here right now because of the 2 of you." Grace felt her throat tighten. "You saved me, Grace," Helen said, turning to her. "When no one else would have stopped, you did, and you gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go." "You were worth saving," Grace said softly. Helen smiled, then turned to David. "And you, my sweet boy, you made mistakes, but you came back, and that's what matters." David's eyes filled with tears. "I'm still sorry, Mom. Every day I'm sorry." "I know," Helen said. "But it's time to forgive yourself, because I already have." David wiped his eyes and nodded. Helen reached out and took both of their hands. I want you both to know something. You're not just taking care of me, you're giving me a reason to keep going. You're giving me a family, and that's the greatest gift anyone could ever give. Grace and David looked at each other across the room, and in that moment, they understood. They weren't just three people living together. They were a family broken and patched together, imperfect and messy, but real. Grace stood in the kitchen, pouring coffee into 3 mugs. Outside she could hear Helen humming in the garden, and David's voice as he talked on the phone about a new business deal. She smiled to herself. A year ago she had been a lonely young woman working double shifts just to survive. Now, she was in her 2nd year of nursing school, living in a real home surrounded by people she loved. David walked into the kitchen, ending his call. "Morning," he said with a smile. "Morning," Grace replied, handing him a mug. "How'd the call go?" "Good," David said. "Really good actually, we just landed a major contract." "That's amazing," Grace said, genuinely happy for him. David leaned against the counter, looking thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" David looked at her, his expression sincere. "I know we've never really talked about this officially, but I want you to know that you're not just someone who lives here. You're family, my sister if you'll have me." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'd like that." David grinned. "Good. Because Mom's been calling you her daughter for months now, and I figured I should make it official." Grace laughed, wiping her eyes. "Sounds like a plan." They clinked their coffee mugs together, and through the window they could see Helen waving at them from the garden, a wide smile on her face. Grace thought back to that cold night 1.5 years ago, when she had found a lost woman on a sidewalk and made a choice that changed everything. She had chosen kindness, she had chosen love, and in return she had found something she thought she'd lost forever. A family. The community center was buzzing with activity. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, mixing with the soft chatter of volunteers and the clinking of dishes being prepared in the kitchen. Grace stood at the entrance, clipboard in hand, checking off names as families arrived for the weekly community dinner. She was 25 now, a registered nurse working at the local hospital. But every Saturday she came here to the place she and David had built together. "Grace," a small voice called out. A little girl with pigtails ran up to her, wrapping her arms around Grace's legs. "Miss Grace, look what I drew." Grace knelt down, taking the crayon drawing from the girl's hands. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. "Is this your family?" Grace asked. The girl nodded enthusiastically. "That's me and Mommy, and Daddy, we just moved into our new apartment." Grace's heart swelled. She remembered this family. They had been homeless 6 months ago, living in their car. Now they were getting back on their feet. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." The girl beamed and ran off to join the other children. David appeared beside Grace, carrying a large box of donated clothes. "We're going to need more space soon," he said, looking around at the crowded room. "This place is getting too small." "That's a good problem to have," Grace said with a smile. David set down the box and wiped his forehead. His company had grown significantly over the past 3 years, but he still showed up every Saturday to volunteer. "I was thinking maybe we could open a second location, somewhere on the east side of town." Grace looked at him thoughtfully. "That would be amazing. But it's a lot of work." "We've handled a lot of work before," David said, nudging her shoulder. "Besides, we're a pretty good team." Grace grinned. "Yeah, we are." The sound of a familiar voice drew their attention. Helen sat at one of the long tables, surrounded by elderly residents from the assisted living facility nearby. She was teaching them how to knit, her hands moving deftly despite her age. Her memory had its ups and downs. Some days were better than others, but she was happy, and she was loved. "Your mother's really in her element today," Grace observed. David's expression softened as he watched his mother laugh at something one of the residents said. "She is. You know, she told me yesterday that these Saturdays are her favorite days of the week." "Mine too," Grace admitted. A young man approached them, nervously clutching a resume. "Excuse me, are you Grace and David, the ones who run this place?" "That's us," David said warmly. "What can we do for you?" The young man took a deep breath. I heard you help people find jobs and housing. I just got out of a bad situation and I'm trying to get back on my feet. I'll do anything. Clean, cook, whatever you need. I need a chance." Grace and David exchanged a knowing look. They had heard this story before. They had lived this story before. "What's your name?" Grace asked gently. "Marcus," the young man said. "Well, Marcus," David said, extending his hand. "Let's talk. I think we can help you out." Marcus's eyes filled with tears of relief as he shook David's hand. Thank you so much." As Marcus walked away with David to discuss opportunities, Grace felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned to find Helen standing beside her, her eyes bright and knowing. "You've built something beautiful here, sweetheart," Helen said softly. Grace smiled, wrapping her arm around Helen's shoulders. "We all built it together." Helen patted Grace's hand. "You know, I don't remember everything about how we all came together. But I remember the important part, that when I needed someone most you were there. And you didn't just give me a place to sleep, you gave me a reason to wake up every morning." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "You gave me the same thing, Helen. You and David both." Helen squeezed her hand. "Family isn't always about blood, is it? Sometimes it's about who shows up, who stays, who chooses to love you even when it's hard." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. They stood together watching the community center filled with people, some struggling, some healing, all hoping for a better tomorrow. This place had started with one act of kindness on a cold sidewalk, and now it had grown into something neither Grace nor David could have imagined. A place where strangers became family, where the lost found a home, where broken people learned to heal together. David returned, slinging an arm around both Grace and his mother. "You know what?" he said, looking around at the crowded room. "I think we're doing something right." Grace leaned into him, feeling Helen's warmth on her other side. "Yeah," she said softly. "I think we are." And as the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting golden light across the faces of everyone gathered there, Grace understood something profound. The warmth of strangers had saved her life once, and now she was passing that warmth forward. One person, one moment, one choice at a time. Because that's what love does, it multiplies, it spreads, it comes back around. And it never ever runs out. Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.